It's a great pleasure to be hosting an inaugural Artist Fellows presentation today. Before anything, there's been a lot of preparation for this day, so I want to start with what we'll do many times today, I'm sure, which is a big round of applause for all of the artists that have been involved in making today possible. As I'm sure many of you, hopefully not all of you know, the Aspen Art Museum was actually founded by a group of renegade artists who really saw the potential and the need for a place to convene and come together to share the importance of the artist's role in our world. And so we're really built by artists, and it makes perfect sense that we would be able to share an artist from our community here today. So we're grateful to the Questrom Education Fund for making this program free, as well as to the Laffey-McHugh Foundation for this year's support. And I'm also deeply grateful to my colleague, Teresa Booth-Brown, who is our artist program coordinator, who has really been the person that's made this possible. It's really thanks to Teresa that we've kind of built up this initiative and our kind of multi-tiered initiatives for artists. So if you haven't met Teresa, I'm going to introduce her now to tell us more about the fellowship. Please stick around and get to know her. And please join me in welcoming her to the stage. Teresa.
Good evening and welcome. Welcome to the Aspen Art Museum Artist Fellowship Project presentations for 2019 and 20. This is the inaugural year, as Michelle pointed out, for this program, and we're glad that you have chosen to join us this evening to recognize and to celebrate our 4 artists. The fellowship created an opportunity for exchange and in-depth conversation both between the artists and with museum staff, and with visiting museum professionals from other museums. We invited artists to think differently about their own work within the context of the fellowship, and what you'll experience here tonight is the product of their thinking. Each of our 4 artist fellows will be presenting in 4 very different ways, their individual projects, as well as a look into their different artistic processes. The presentations will be between 11 and 20 minutes long. At the end of the presentations, I'm going to ask all the artists to come back up here, and we'll open up the microphone to questions from the audience. So if you would please hold your questions until the end of the program. I would also like to just say that it has been a great honor to work with you 4, and it's been my pleasure to shepherd you through this process of the past 9 months. So thank you to you. Let's get started with our exciting program. So tonight, first up is going to be, it's my pleasure to introduce Michael Lorsung.
I'd just like to say thanks to Teresa and to Heidi and to everyone else who's put a lot of hard work into this. Of course, the other 3 fellows who are here, and all of you who've decided to show up here. This is wonderful. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I spent my time thinking about for these last 9 months while I was working with the other fellows and various guests and Teresa. But I was told a long time ago that I should start any presentation that I do by showing somebody else's work. And so this is not my work. This is a Brazilian artist, Cildo Meidales. I screwed that up. Lou's telling me that, that's fine. It's from about 1970, and the reason I'm showing this work actually has to do with a quote that was excerpted from a show catalog that included this work. The title of the work is Insertions into Ideological Circuits, the Coca-Cola Project, and it was one of a couple of works that he did in this vein. And the quote is, when the object of art becomes a practice, it becomes something over which you can have no control or ownership. And the project that he was undertaking with these Coke bottles, in many countries, when soft drink bottles are returned, they're rinsed and refilled. And he saw an opportunity in a time of great political turmoil to use this as a vessel for spreading propaganda, basically. And so he was printing on these Coke bottles instructions to manufacture Molotov cocktails. And then they would go back out into the world, and as they were filled back up with Coke, that would become more visible and stand out as a graphic symbol on these objects. And I'm really interested in systems. I'm really interested in the way that the world works and the way that we interact with it. A lot of our lives right now are so dependent on these things that are really sort of traveling right below the surface of the currents that we're inhabiting. And we don't oftentimes ask ourselves, we're not asked by the systems to really think about what they are and who they involve and what our sort of implicit participation in these things is. I moved to the Valley here a couple of years ago. And when I moved here, one of the things I was struck by, I came here from southeastern Ohio on the West Virginia border, which is an area where we used to make a lot of things, and now we don't make a lot of things. And I moved to an area where almost nothing is manufactured. And in fact, everything that I need for my life, for my studio practice, is imported and shipped to me. A lot of you are probably really familiar with this, with getting an Amazon package, having something FedExed in, FedExing something out. As a sculptor and as someone who works with material and is interested in objects, that was an immediate concern, was like, well, where does my work go and how does it leave this place? And what does that mean? And so I started thinking about the process of shipping. And I started researching and reading, and I came upon some information about UPS and about FedEx. And I knew sort of peripherally a brief history, and I won't go into it too deeply, about sort of why it is that UPS drivers are largely unionized and why FedEx drivers aren't. And it has to do with the fact that the UPS falls under the National Labor Relations Act, while FedEx, which was formed as an air carrier, actually falls under the Railway Labor Act. And the difference there, basically, really quickly, is that the drivers at UPS, they can form a local Teamsters union. They can get together as a group in a city or in a municipality and form that union. Whereas FedEx, because of the way that they're governed under the Labor Act, that they're governed under, they would have to come to a consensus as a national group, which would basically be like asking us to elect a president by having us all come to a consensus. It's probably not going to happen. And so as a result, you've got this whole sort of population of people who are working behind the scenes. And I think a lot about that. I think a lot about sort of what happens when something leaves my presence and goes out into the world, whether it's art or a package, you know, or a piece of refuse that I'm throwing away. You know, it has a life after it leaves my site, but oftentimes we're not really encouraged to think about these things. And so I decided to build a box. And it's a 16, it's about 16 inches by about 14 inches by 22 or so inches. It's a wooden box. And on each side of the box, facing out from the inside, is a small pinhole camera. And each camera is actuated every 60 seconds. And I thought a lot about sort of what kind of information I wanted to gather as this thing was transiting the country on its route and what that meant. And I thought about photography, and I thought about sort of portraiture. And then I thought about landscape, and I thought about all of these sort of things that this thing was going to encounter. And I have these, you know, like most of us, when we think about how something's made, we think about a factory, or we think about an assembly line, or we have these assumptions about what's actually going on. And usually we're pretty wrong, because usually it's sort of this amalgamation of a bunch of things that we've heard or seen, but never really the actual thing. And so I thought, what I really want to do is to try to document some of this and to try to understand something about it through that process. The interesting thing about this entire experience for me as a fellow is that it took me out of a space in my own studio practice where I was working towards something, where there was an endpoint, where there was a show, where a piece of work needed to go from here to there, and it had to end in being complete in a particular way. And the work that I've been doing recently for the last 5 or so years in my studio is very much about sort of that completion. It's very much about sort of seeing a process through. A lot of the work is kinetic, and so it has to function in a particular way in order for it to work. And what I thought was interesting about this project as I started thinking about it was that I had no guarantees of success. And in fact, I encountered a lot of what maybe I early on thought about as failure. You know, I sent this thing out a few times, and I never really got what I wanted out of it. I'll show you guys the results of it, and we can look at that in a minute. But I never really sort of, you know, when I sent it out, I sort of had this beautiful vision of like, wow, I'm going to have these 6 camera angles that are going to be sort of this document of this journey that this thing took. And the reality is actually that a lot of it's in the dark, and very little of it involves people, although there are people. and that really, maybe photography, it really started getting me thinking about maybe photography is not sort of the media that needs to be documenting this process. And so I started this, I guess the reason I'm telling you this is because I wanted this presentation to reflect my experience as a fellow here and not just a document of a piece of work that was completed. And I think really the important kind of takeaway for me about this experience was that I began to understand my studio practice as being on a continuum rather than sort of existing between points. And so this project has sort of evolved in my head as I've moved through it and become a variety of things. But I want to get back to really briefly sort of the transit itself. So this is a document, this is basically the manifest, it has a tracking number, it has a total weight, it has all of these things that should tell you something about it. And I thought a lot about whether or not I wanted to present the object or have an image of the object. But I'm actually much more interested in this thing being a black box. I'm interested in it being something that exists from the same perspective that you or I have. It's really difficult to be self-aware if you can never see yourself. And I see sort of technology in this context as lacking that kind of self-awareness. It's recording, but it's unable to sort of understand itself. And so the only sort of means that I wanted to understand this thing through was through document. So I chose to just include those things. And again, this goes to sort of how I think about these objects and how I think about things leaving my presence and moving into the world and leaving traces. And these are the traces that we're leaving consistently and that we have to kind of prove that these things have existed. When you've sent something out, do you really know if it actually arrived? I mean, you can get confirmation, you could talk to someone, but it really sort of, you can take that question into sort of an existential line that really kind of relates back to our understanding of our own existence and whether or not I'm having this conversation with myself or with a group of people that I'm looking at or that I think I'm looking at. And so I'm interested in sort of how those kind of pools overlap one another and how sort of object has human quality when you give it the ability to observe and record and be a part of a conversation and be a part of an action rather than sort of being a passive thing that's being served by a variety of systems and people involved in those systems. And so here's the actual sort of, excuse me, here's the actual sort of map of the transit from where it actually began to where it went next. And it's interesting because it went from here to a small town in Louisiana called Ruston on this particular transit. And it went all the way out to the West Coast first because, again, it's like we think about things and, we think about sort of transit in a very particular way. We think about it in terms of roads and in terms of, how do we do something efficiently for ourselves? And then when you start thinking about logistics and you start thinking about, well, how do trucks move and how do sort of distribution hub and spoke networks function, then all of a sudden kind of path and course over ground becomes a lot more convoluted from our point of view, but from the point of view of a package or from the point of view of a larger system that's trying to guarantee delivery within 3 days, it starts to actually make some sense. And so all of these things are kind of clues that we can pull apart and that I can pull apart and try to sort of find that commonality and understand the perspective of this thing that really has no agency or sense of self on its own. And so this is just tracking it through sort of where it went and why it went there. The other part of this project for me, and I think it actually became less important as I progressed through it, was that I felt a certain inherent complicity in this thing, in this system that I wasn't sure I was entirely comfortable being a part of. But I also knew that I didn't have a lot of choice. If I'm going to live in a place like this, my options are to participate in this sort of thing or to live basically a subsistence lifestyle that doesn't afford me the opportunity to necessarily participate in things like this or other things that make my life of a quality that I perceive as being valuable. And so I felt like, initially when I started thinking about this, that was exactly kind of what I wanted to engage with. I wanted to have proof that I had done this, and I wanted to have proof that I was a part of it, and I wanted it to be a little bit jarring. I felt a little bit uncomfortable with the idea that this thing was going out into a space. It was photographing people, and I didn't have any control over that except that I was sort of releasing it, and they didn't have any control or knowledge of that. But I wanted that sort of I wanted that hook to be there for me, because I felt like it, and I feel in a lot of the work that I do that it's really important, and that if I want to talk about an issue that I'm concerned about, the way to talk about it is not to point and not to tell you what you're doing, because the reality is that we're all sort of living in the same culture. We're all coming at it from a variety of different socioeconomic perspectives and histories and everything else, but we're all equally complicit in it. And I think for me, the first step in sort of understanding that complicity is by acknowledging it myself and embracing it in some ways. Because if I can show you, if I can tell a person, hey, this is me, this is part of my life, this is part of my experience, I think it becomes a lot easier for people to understand their own participation or lack of participation in those particular things, rather than sort of talking about it in the abstract or in the third person. Again, this sort of fell away from me, and part of the reason that it fell away was because I didn't get the results that I wanted. I thought a lot about, as I was getting this thing back, and I was getting a lot of black images or images that were just completely illegible, or images that just weren't really providing me with kind of the results that I wanted. I was really looking for sort of this, I had this archetype of an image in my mind where somebody was picking up this box and it was photographing them as it was picking it up. And that never really happened. I mean, I'm sure it happened, but it was never really captured in the way that I wanted it to. And so I was actually thinking about this thing as a technological object, and I was thinking about other technological objects that we put out into places. And I began to sort of start thinking about the distribution network that is Federal Express as a kind of outer space, or as a kind of deep sea. It's this thing that's walled off from my existence. It's separate from my life as I know it here and now. And yet it exists in the world, and I have very little access to it. And so in some ways, this thing started to become kind of a satellite for me, or a probe, or a submarine. It was this way of simultaneously understanding something in some way, even if I was sort of gathering little bits of data and then compiling those things, and then taking that back and examining it and pulling it apart and going like, oh, what happened here? What am I looking at? And so that kind of led me to the next stage of this project. And this is something that I intend to sort of continue. But the next sort of phase in this, and what I've already sort of begun doing, is building a sensor network that goes inside of this box to measure things like acceleration of the object, relative position of the object through GPS positioning, and through sort of a triangulation using Wi-Fi networks, and using all of these systems that already exist around us as a way to better understand this thing that I'm a part of, but I'm completely separate from. And so I want to just kind of finish this up by showing you guys the one image that I did decide to include. I initially thought, like, this is going to be great. This is going to be this, like, sort of animated montage of these things as it goes across this timeline. And instead it became, for me, much more interesting to sort of think about it as a singular event. And that singular event for me was this. And this is a really hard image to read. But this is where the package on its last transit en route to Ruston, Louisiana, is being unloaded from the truck and into a distribution center. And what I like about it is that there's a person in it, there's a figure, there's a second object, and so you're viewing this box, this other package, someone else's package en route to somewhere else, from the perspective of what I've sent, and you're seeing a person interacting with it. And for me, in some ways, from the photographic end of this project, somehow this became enough. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Next up, it is my pleasure to introduce Shannon Richardson.
Hi, everyone. First, I'd love to say thank you all for being here. This is a pretty amazing turnout. I'd love to thank Teresa and Heidi and the Aspen Art Museum for including me. I'll wait till my thing pulls up here. Thank you. Perfect. And my clicky. All right. It's been an amazing honor and privilege to be a part of this inaugural team, so thank you. I took this picture on my way up here to my March visit from Paonia, and I thought that it really clearly demonstrated my dedication and my drive to make the most of this opportunity. And I want to thank my fellow fellows. You've inspired and challenged me, and I really appreciate it, and it's been an honor to work with you. And I want to thank my incredible husband. Thank you. So I live in Paonia. I was the only one outside of this valley, so I'm in the North Fork Valley. I've been there for about 3 years. I have a beautiful studio loft space above the Blue Sage Center for the Arts. This is my lovely window. I spend a lot of time daydreaming up there. And so here's sort of an interior shot of our space. And it's just really been incredible. I share the upstairs loft space with 2 other women artists. And this is the view from my bay window, which is distracting and inspiring all at the same time. I'm mainly focused on working on this large painting that I did. It's an oil on canvas. I did several other works that I will also address to you, but mainly I documented this to talk about the process of creating a narrative. I consider myself a narrative-driven figurative painter. I'm an oil painter. And the work starts, I like to call this the company I keep. It's like my family picture wall. So this is the original shot that I did in the first probably half hour that I started working on this painting. And so this is really where they all start. There's no real intentions. I don't really know where I'm going. I really just am reacting to a basic mark making. And much like the Rorschach inkblot test, I start seeing images and shapes come through. I do this process because I like to say that I trust my imagination and my medium more than my intentions, and so I prefer to follow the paint as I go. And so if you pay attention real quickly to this little spot here, you'll see that it transitions into the final image. Should. Thank you. And what you'll see right here is this did become the rabbit, which I believe is a central figure in the final image. So, oops, gotcha. So I'm fascinated by optical illusions. This is one of my favorites. I don't know if you're familiar with it or not. I recently learned it was called My Wife, My Mother-in-Law. I always thought it was called The Old Woman and the Young Woman. If you're not familiar with this, real quickly, I'll explain to you that there's 2 ways to view this singular image. And one is supposedly what you react to and what you see is telling you something about your subconscious. So if you see the old woman, you would be looking directionally this way, and here's her chin and her mouth. Here's her nose and her 2 eyes. And she's got sort of this large shawl on. And then if you see the young woman, imagine her looking sort of away. And this is her jawline, and she's wearing a choker. And there's the outline of her nose, and that would be her ear. So I play a lot with that with an imagery I see with my mark making. Another way to do it is to look at the positive and the negative shapes. And so in this one, most people directly will see the black pillars or chess pieces. I'm not sure what they are. But then if you look at the negative space or the light space between them, you see the silhouettes of 2 people looking inwards at each other. And so these are visual cues that I look for when my abstracts are starting to take more form. I'll reference this specifically in a moment, but this is a pretty easy one, and it's the dodo bird or the rabbit. So if you see the rabbit with the ears coming this way, or it's the dodo bird, and there's the beak, and there's the eye looking this way. So the first painting that I completed, I started a couple weeks before I even learned about the fellowship that I'd received it. And in true form to working something out and not knowing what's really going on quite yet, I was sort of battling with this painting and wondering why these characters were all together. They were so different and disjointed, and I wasn't quite sure about it. And in preparation for the fellows and Teresa to come to a studio visit in Paonia, I just met them all and realized that we're all coming from very different creative angles. I realized that there was 5 of us and 5 of them. And so right before they all came, I finished this painting and I titled it, I'm Not Sure How We Fit Together Yet. And when they came to the studio and I showed it to them, they were asking who's who. I still don't know. So in reference to the duck or the dodo bird and the rabbit, this was a very small portion of the painting. And initially what I had seen is I would say that that would be the nose, there would be 2 eyes, a mouth, and then the ears coming out to the side. So I would make some decisions at that point of where it was going. And then, I think this will work. That's all right, close enough. And then you can see through a series of small edits and decisions, this was how the final figure actually appeared to me. But you can still see that this was where the nose was, and then I turned it directionally that way. Here you can see them side by side. So this was sort of early on in the rough stages, and then the decisions that led to that character. There's a term for this. It's so exciting. It's pareidolia. Let's say that right. And it's the tendency to interpret a vague stimulus as something known to the observer, such as scene shapes and clouds, faces in inanimate objects, or abstract patterns, or hearing hidden messages in music. This is very natural to me, almost to the point where it's also distracting because I can't stop seeing these things, and when you see shapes in buildings. And I think we practice that when we're children, looking at shapes and clouds, using our imagination. So I try to practice that as much as possible, and I encourage you all to do it yourself. You can see things. This is a picture I found, and obviously when you look at it, most people would see an angel. I'm going to share with you my favorite one to introduce people to. We are all very, very familiar with this. You hang your coat on it everywhere, and I recently learned there's a meme on the internet, and it's called Drunk Octopus Wants to Fight. And I dare you the next time you hang your coat up on one of these to not see Drunk Octopus Wants to Fight. So this is just a short video where it shows sort of my process using my favorite tool. I have it in my pocket. I'm using it like a little worry rub today, but it's a squeegee. And it's a really great way for me to work fast and focus on sort of the darks and lights and cutting out the silhouettes of the different shapes that I end up seeing. And then here, if you focus on this little character here in the bottom, which is just a basic mark making, you'll see how I start to define it and a creature emerges. And so it's trusting the instinct of what I see and then my immediate reaction to it, and creating a dialogue between myself and the paint where the paint will reveal to me a shape or an idea, and then I react back to it, creating this conversation by defining the different shapes. And so you can start to sort of see how the fox-ish figure is emerging. Oops. This is, I like to think about in the large paintings, this part right here is actually this detail of probably about this inch on this large painting here. But I love to make sure that when I look at a larger work like this, the idea that I could look at a very small portion of it and find a little abstract that would also be interesting. So I'd like to share with you a couple other works that I've been doing over this time. This one's called Here, Hold My Palette. This is called That Friend That We Never Talk About. This is The Bridge Between the Roses. Love and Confusion. The Saint of Extraordinary Beings. The Pride. This is The Procession. Never Turn Your Back on the Sky. Petal Thrower, Flower Grower. This one's called Migration. And this one's called Reunion of the Ghost Horse Band. And I wanted to share these with you because titles are a very important part of my storytelling. And to further that practice, I often write little narratives for my paintings, and I'm going to share one with you. I can't really call them poems or poetry because I feel like that's very sophisticated. So I've settled on referring to them as nursery rhymes. And so I'd like to share with you real quick my other pocket. This is a 32 by 70 painting. It's called Honeymoon for Eternity. It says, Ode to that sweetest honeymoon, I'm so glad we had our time, where I was only yours, I thought, and so you were just mine. I thought us two could only be, at least just for a bit, the greatest of you and me. Our hearts were then so lit. But then all of a sudden, life found its way back home, and all our love of chaos never gave us the space to roam. That time alone together, it now has come to pass, and as the circus comes closer, let us not make us a task. And know the tenderness, my love, will never leave, don't fear, but I see the comets coming in, and that chaos is so near. So please give us a bit of time as we try to find our way, and in these moments with you, my love, remember we'll still play. So to that cast of characters, to that great time of glee, please just give us one honeymoon to frolic and love so free. So I read those for most of the work that I do. And then, so this is the painting. I worked on it for about 4 or 5 months, along with all the other stuff. And I was asked recently if I thought it was complete, and that's a very challenging decision to make when there is no real direction or final outcome that you are aiming towards. So it's complete for now, as I wanted to share it with you. And a friend of mine in this discussion shared with me this really amazing quote by the composer John Cage. And it says, when you start working, everybody is in your studio. The past, your friends, enemies, the art world, and above all, your own ideas. All are there. But as you continue painting, they start leaving one by one, and you are left completely alone. Then, if you are lucky, even you leave. I just love that. So I thought in closing, before my last little video, I would show you not necessarily what maybe is a completed painting, but what is wet on my easel right now. So I decided to start another one instead of obsessing about that one. They're the same size. So this is what I'm working on now. And then I have a little 4-minute video that shows the progression of the painting from beginning to end. I made a small edited version into a flip book that you're welcome to take. They're on the table on your way out. So hopefully this will work. Okay.
Thank you, Shannon. Next up, it is my great pleasure to introduce Wewer Keohane.
Thank you. Oh, man. Thank you all for coming. This is just touching. I especially want to thank Heidi and Michelle and Teresa for choosing me to be part of this program, and of course my fellow fellows. And also, along with thanking all of you who have come, I want to give a little extra thanks to some friends who came as far away as from North Carolina, Montana, Texas, and the Front Range, and all the way from West Glenwood, too. Thank you so much. This fellowship, I almost didn't put my name in the hat. And several people said, well, why not? And I said, well, I just won't get chosen. I mean, I just don't think they would choose me. And they were like, why not? And I couldn't really tell them why not. I just didn't feel like I'd get chosen. So when I did, and Teresa called me, I had to sit down. I was just so taken to be involved in this 9 months that have really changed the way I see myself. Because the honor of being named a fellow at the Aspen Art Museum with the level of fellows that I've joined has given me an ability to see myself a little more like other people see me. Not as this old woman who still thinks she's 36 and is, just sort of having fun making art, It really has changed me in the sense of my inner confidence and sense of self, and I'm forever grateful for that. Thank you. That's okay, I will in a second. I need this later. This is my artist statement. The name of my presentation is Embracing Mystery, and there's a little handout for you to take home on the back table that has that stamped on it. My art is an outward expression of an inner journey, a quest to make the invisible visible. That's my artist statement, and I thought, well, how can I show you what that kind of means to me? It seems a little esoteric. So if you would close your eyes and put your hands together and rub them very, very vigorously till you feel the heat, and then slowly pull them apart. You feel that invisible energy there? That's what I try to capture in my work. So that's about as close as I can get to describing that. I work from my dreams as inspiration, the dreams I have at night. And this is one of my little dream journals. And this is how big this is. It's little. But instead of transcribing the dream, I usually collage it or paint it or draw it. And it gives me a different way of working with the dream than doing it psychologically, which I also do, or spiritually. This dream I called a fallen star. And when I did this first collage of it, and I had done it right before the fellowship started. In the dream, I come over and I lift up the star and I throw it back up into the sky where it belongs. And I kind of got the sense of what that was about for me, but I was so fascinated by this star. In the dream, it was so radiant that I wanted to, in the fellowship, change the way that dreams influenced my work. Instead of doing the collages that sort of tell the story of the dream, I wanted to exhaust working on the dream until the symbol that means the most to me becomes the piece of art. So that's sort of what propelled me through my project, which I'll share with you along with a couple other things. When Teresa asked us to come for the first meeting, she wanted us to tell sort of our story of, you know, why we were artists, what were we doing or whatever, and I thought, oh my gosh, I've had a long life to tell in 20 minutes, and what am I going to do? And I was sharing with my wonderful husband, Steve, this, and he helped me graphically do the pie of life. So I divided my life up into 9-year sections, and then I just started filling them up with all the things I could think of that I did. And in the first half of my life, until almost 40, I realized that there were a couple threads. There was a thread of loss and recovery, and there was a spiritual thread, and there was a kind of a foundation of who I really became. I feel like I had a huge shift in my life after I turned 40, in actually being who I really am based on all those experiences. So this will weave into this in a minute. And in the little handout that I have, you have a little pie of life to do this exercise yourself. If we had decided to do classes instead of a presentation, that's probably what I would have done. So that kind of got me started on thinking. Now, I went back to this dream after our first meeting, and I did another collage of it that got a little bit closer to the radiance of the star. And then what happened was stars started appearing everywhere. And I was reading a magazine, and it was how to make a star. And I said to Steve, don't we have an old styrofoam ball? And he said, yeah. And so he found the styrofoam ball, and I had all these sticks that I have a collection of just junk in the studio. So I made this star, and along the way, I'll talk about that in a minute, about some of the reading. I started going around the house and collecting all the star things, and then my husband Steve made me, you can't probably see this, but it's a beautiful star to wear throughout the whole fellowship to sort of keep me on point, right? And then for my birthday, he made me earrings that are really cool. The star, the shooting star, and the moon. Oh, this collage felt to me the closest to the energy of the dream. There's just something about it that feels like it felt to lift that star into the sky. This was the closest to that. I made myself a star mobile to put over where I work, just to, again, shower me with this theme that I was working with. And I'm a voracious reader. So these are all the books that I read, just the art books or so, that I read during the fellowship. And in You Are the Universe, Deepak Chopra and Menas Kapatos really talked a lot about the fact that we are all from the same stardust. So that brought an even deeper meaning to my dream, and it all started to influence the work. Well, I decided that I was going to do a book for my project. And either the Pie of Life or these two other bodies of work that I had done. The one on the left is a body of work that's about non-duality and the power of the sacred marriage that we talk about in dream work. And the one on the right was a conceptual body of work about the gravity of the moon. And it was a year-long process of seeing each day how the gravity of the moon changed paint that was in the same viscosity. And I think between the Pie of Life project or idea and these two bodies of work, I decided to make a round book. So I started playing with wood, and still again, that was sort of a nursery rhyme, like Shannon, of the dream. And then I have all this handmade round paper, and I started drawing on it and doing collages, and it wasn't working. And the winter came, and I got out this big blue velvet duvet that I had made from the velvet that I had bought to cover the sofa, but the upholsterer wouldn't work with the velvet because it was too hard to work with. And it looked like the night sky. And at the same time that I found the velvet, I found all these old embroidery hoops that I didn't know I had. And I immediately saw that the round book would have a cover of the star. This is partially sewn here in the embroidery hoops. And then I started having major doubts. I was like, oh my God, I'm a woman artist and I'm sewing on velvet. This is like, I can't do this. I can't do this. I'm a serious artist. I mean, I'm going to be a throwback. They're going to laugh at me, all that stuff. So I had to gather myself and give myself a little lecture. And this is my philosophy of life right here. And I have to bring it up when moments like that come. And that is, this is what I try to live by in my life, but it is especially helpful in the studio. To make no comparisons, to make no judgments, and to let go of the need to control the results. And this quote by Krishnamurti, you can probably not see, it's, the ability to observe without evaluation is the highest form of intelligence. And after, repeating this as a mantra for a few days, I decided I loved my cover of my book, and I was gonna go forward and see what happened. While studying astrology and, astronomy, I came across my own constellation, and I decided that would be a perfect back of the book. So I laid it out with rhinestones. And in 1979, I bought a jacket in Japan, really cool jacket that I finally couldn't wear anymore, but it had these cool latches on it. And I was just determined that this was going to be the closure of the book. I was kind of attached to that result. I ended up sewing the stars in the constellation on the back cover. I did use the clasp. That's showing all the pieces of the book had to be clamped together in order to drill holes so that I could bind the book. And I ended up realizing that the handmade paper was not going to work. It just didn't work. I didn't like what happened with paint on it. It was too inconsistent. I didn't want to do my original ideas of taking all these symbols from each of the slices of pie and, sewing them in. It just felt like too much. So I let that go, and I started working with round birch wood as the pages of the book. And I came up with the idea of deconstructing the star and just literally working with the star imagery until I just exhausted it and fully understood it for myself. So this piece, my work is really for me. It is the way I work things out. It's the way I understand my dreams, which help me understand my place in the world, which help me be a better person each day, I hope. And so this whole process, what I knew was about me deconstructing something about that star. That was me. Let's see. I could not get the thing bound. I tried hinges. I tried bookbinder's linen. I tried sewing it with the silver thread that I had sewn with, and the book just kept collapsing. And the hinges looked too, they just didn't look good. So we live out in the country, and so I went outside and stood under the stars that I was doing work about and just sort of let it go. And that same, I think it was the next day, we had a session, the fellows, and I was telling everybody that, you know, I was really having a tough time with the binding. I just couldn't get the dadgum book to bind, and to my satisfaction. And after that meeting, I went home and I thought, I'm just going to use the good old bookbinder's wax linen. And I went to my archives of bookbinder's linen. I've been a bookmaker for a long time. And there I had the exact color. So that's what I did. I bound the book with wax linen, and this is the book. So the book, I decided to do the deconstruction of the stars, and that sort of represents me, and then the other side of the book represents sort of the pie of life sections, or the cycles of my life through the moon. I had to, you know, I think my friend Nancy said, you got to have something to put it in. And I went, oh, okay, I'll build a box. So I made a box. Then I made it a blankie, a book a blankie. And here's the book. And the thing about this book is, it doesn't stand up because it's round, and it won't stand up. And I got very frustrated with that until I realized I don't try to stand up the books that I read. And I got kind of excited about this because about 20 years ago, Steve and I were at the Musée de Cluny in Paris, which has the illuminated manuscripts, and I was so taken by them. I had just started really doing a lot of bookmaking, and I realized that I actually had made myself an illuminated book, and those illuminated books aren't displayed standing up. They're displayed laying down so you can unfold them. So I got over that. But my clasp from Japan is really cool, right? Well, I realized that I had done that for me, so I thought, what else can I do? And Michael had one day said, after seeing my studio, that I was a curator, and I do have a lot of stuff in my studio. And when I found the velvet, I found all these old embroidered hoops. I don't even know what I ever did with them. I don't know why I had them. But I realized if I laid those out, I loved the drape of the velvet. And when you put it in the hoop and it draped, I thought that would be the greatest wall hanging. And what I could do is sew the imagery from each slice of the pie into 8 of those, and then have 2 empty ones so that I could get to be 99, and make it a wall hanging. And then we adopted a puppy. Okay. And the shelter gave us a dog brush to take home. And I brushed her. First night we had her home, brushed her, made the mistake of leaving her with the brush, and she decimated it. And all the tines came out on the floor, and I looked at them and I went, oh, they look like the light and energy that comes out of a star. And I collected them all up, put in a little box, and I decided that my wall hanging was going to be a ceiling hanging. And here it is above you, and this is it looking from afar. So all those that represent the deconstructed stars are tines from Moksha's brush. Okay? I had again to let go of the drape of the fabric, because in order to do this, I had to fold everything over, screw everything together. You know, it became another kind of nightmare project because I kept not thinking ahead enough. This would be a very logical thing to create, and I kept not thinking ahead enough and having to take it apart and go back and do it again. this is what happened to the handmade paper. It became the backs of this. Steve painted all those for me. I inlaid them in. And then, when I was curating my studio, I found this vintage, probably antique, folding yardstick, which had been my father's. And I laid it out to give it more support, and I realized that in laying it out, it formed the constellation, my constellation, which is Taurus. And it also holds this up, and that's representing as a metaphor of my father and my history with my father holding me up. He was so great. Oh, wait. While I was going through everything, I started finding all these old prints I had made or some that other people had made, lots of old photography, photograms that I had done years and years ago, one of my absolutely favorite mediums to work in. And I started a whole new series with using those and still using the star theme, moving into the Big Bang theme. And these are just two of the many that I've made since then. Excuse me. Yeah, okay. Then I decided I absolutely had to make a book that stood up. So, and I had leftover handmade paper, and I needed a new dream journal. So I actually made a book that would stand up, filled it with the paper. So I felt sort of complete after that. And that day, after finishing that and finishing the this ceiling piece, excuse me, I went out in our yard, and the sun was setting, and I just started thinking about completing the fellowship. And instead of getting sad about it, I thought, this is something that my dad used to say, every exit is an entry. And so I'm just looking forward to what's next. I'm incredibly grateful for what's happened. Thank you. Thanks, Kylie. And I see this as a really valuable and meaningful 9 months of my life. And thank you so much for coming, and please pick up a little pie of life for yourself on your way out. Thank you.
For our final presentation by Andrew Roberts Gray, he's given me a few instructions, which I'm going to read to you here. For his project presentation, Andrew has created an art performance piece entitled Stalking the Muse. It runs 11 minutes, and in the middle of the piece, there is a silent section, a pause of approximately 30 seconds. Then the piece continues to its end. It is my pleasure to introduce Andrew Roberts Gray. Thank you, Andrew. Come on up. Come on up. I think Andrew might need a second. I guess if you have a question for Andrew, maybe wait a minute. Any questions?
Wewer, since you focused on that one dream for so long, what happened to your dreams during those 9 months?
You know, I'm a prolific dreamer, and I didn't recall another dream for about 7 months while I was focused on that. And actually, it's more like 8.5. The next dream was, it's going to be a whole new series for sure. And I'm going to work with it the same way. Instead of just trying to show the dream, I'm going to try to, exhaust it. So, thanks.
Michael, I'm curious if any part of your process was trying to understand the perspective the box would have.
I think it became that when it, I don't think I went into it with that intent. I didn't, I wasn't trying to sort of anthropomorphize a box, but it became clear to me that the perspective that I was looking at wasn't sort of, it was odd. It was sort of part surveillance and part voyeurism. There was a lot there that wasn't really, didn't feel personal. It didn't feel like a person. So I guess in some ways, like, it ended up being that, but I didn't really start it with the intention that I wanted to kind of give sense to something that was otherwise senseless.
My question is for Shannon Richardson. I was curious, with the animals that come out, do they have significant meaning to you, or do they become people in your life, or tell me more about the animals?
My favorite example of that would be a classical portrait artist who I share a studio with, did a beautiful portrait of her husband, and my sweet husband wondered why he wasn't in any of them, and I pointed out several characters that he had become, and so I do find that they become representations of the people in my life, and it's also why I like to call them fables, which gives a magical element to the different animals and storytelling. And the rabbit, for some reason, just lately has been very prominent in my work, and it seems like when one shows up, it multiplies and becomes the whole painting. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Ruben.
Hi, Andrew. So, having just watched you take down a piece at CMC, which I'm just wondering, how did you come to this very different way of anything that I'm familiar with your work? And fabulous, by the way, but how did you get here?
No, I understand. I'm sure a lot of people are probably, or people that know my work probably are wondering that. So, excuse me, I have to catch my breath. So, recently, I've started to think more and more about my work as layers of cultural reference, layers of material. So when the fellowship happened, I was thinking about that, and we were suggested to us that we might do a presentation, and I had a number of really strong feelings. One was I didn't want to talk about my work, and another is that sort of part of the introduction that I had to the fellowship was, in what I read, was that they were thinking that maybe through the 9 months, we would be able to come to some new understanding of our practice or our relationship to our audience, something like that. So, given where I started, I decided maybe I would try to make something that didn't fit consistently in any genre. I was sort of familiar with painting, sculpture, opera, music. And so as this thing developed, I began to think about it as layers, just as my visual work is, but in a totally different genre. So each of the components, the music would become a layer, the visual projections and the montage would be another kind of this real world sort of layer, and that then there would be a narrative or a story and a dance that was sort of pulled out of my life. So those layers would be next to each other and communicating, but separate. And I wondered if I could make a piece that held together and that, so that's the answer.
One more question?
I have a question. And I'd kind of like to hear from each of you your stance on not only you've shared kind of how you've changed through this process of the fellowship, and I'm wondering what, if you were to meet yourself from 9 months ago, what you would want to tell yourself.
I don't know what I would tell myself 9 months ago. I kind of barely remember it. But, you know, we were actually, I think all of us were kind of talking about this earlier. I was talking to Teresa about sort of your first question. And, you know, I think for me, you know, just sort of this fellowship created a space in my studio practice that previously kind of wasn't there, and I think isn't there for a lot of artists who are kind of actively working and have a series of stuff going on. I think the romantic vision of the artist is that we walk into our studio and we kind of do whatever we want, and things develop and stuff happens and it's all amazing and wonderful. And the reality is not that. And usually is that there's some structure, there's some beginning and end point, or there's a series of beginning and end points. And I think the fellowship for me, it offered me a set of parameters that said there is no outcome that's unacceptable. And here's some facilities and some funding and some resources in the form of a community to do that thing. And that's a pretty rare thing. That's a pretty, I think, you know, I think it happens to people periodically, but it's certainly not consistent. So I think for me, like, that was the biggest kind of shift. And I don't think, I'm not naive enough to believe that that's a permanent shift, but having had the opportunity to do that, it gives me pause when I go back to the studio to think about how it is that I'm working and what I understand to be expected outcomes.
I think initially my concern was about tonight's presentation and the element of public speaking. I would like to tell 9 months ago, Shannon, that it's going to be okay, and people are going to show up and enjoy what you're doing. I wish I would have known that earlier. But I think it reminded me the importance of critical thinking, just being around. I have a really amazing creative artist community in Paonia, and I think just this really working with these other fellows just sort of really took everything to another level, and the critical thinking and challenging and support that we need amongst the creative community, how important that is. So I'm just really grateful you guys are all here.
Good question, Michelle. We had so many conversations during the 9 months with each other, and there are probably a dozen particular comments that really affected me and made me look at myself differently. And one of the main ones was a private studio visit that Teresa honored me with. And we really just sat and talked, and I just had never seen, I saw myself through her eyes as we talked, and there were a couple things I said that her comeback just really was like an eye-opener to me. And one was that I never really labeled myself as any kind of artist. I work from my dreams. That would be it, right? And she helped me see that I am a conceptual artist. I mean, I don't need the label, but I really think a lot. And art has saved my life. And Michael said something one day. We were talking about the stuff, and he said, you are a curator. I mean, look at your studio. And one thing that I was saying to Teresa was, you know, I had been considering not making art and just turning my big studio into a music room library and spending the rest of my life reading. And Teresa said, but Wewer, your studio already is your music room and your library. So you know, I made a new great friend. I see myself differently, and I would tell the younger, 9-month younger Wewer, are you kidding me? You are an artist. You are not going to give up art. It has saved your life. It will continue to. Share it, do it, create it. let go of what anybody else thinks about what you're doing and just do it. And stay here.
That's an easy question. The question I would ask back in October is, do you want to subject your wife to this project? So I think she's felt a little bit like an art widow. You know, you come home from work and your mind is on a lot of other things. And so connecting with your wife is hard, but Annette is very supportive. And this project wouldn't have been realized in the same way, and maybe not realized without her support. So that's my answer.
Well, on that note of vulnerability and really sharing yourselves with us, I'm going to hand it over to Teresa if she has any last thoughts or comments or questions.
Just one more comment. I wanted to say that one thing I was thinking about the whole 9 months, and that really became apparent to me as we developed as a group, is that we are so lucky to set aside time for conversation. Our lives are so busy and so fractured. If I get to talk to somebody, it's usually for just a few minutes. But we were able to meet for several hours repeatedly and have in-depth conversation, and having that with other artists is not only such a treat, I think it's very valuable for everyone's practice. So I guess as a takeaway, my takeaway to all of you is go have a conversation with somebody, a real conversation. It's been a long time since I experienced that, so thank you all for all those wonderful conversations. Our artists will be around for a little bit, so if you have more questions, please approach them. If you'd like to know more information about the fellowship or applying for next year, on the back of tonight's program brochure, there's a little bit of information, or approach one of us. Andrew has one more thing, sure.
I want to thank the whole staff of the museum, Heidi, for instituting this program. I think it's really important for the community, and I know that many people enjoyed following us in our 9-month odyssey. And it was really exciting to be a part of that. And, you know, being a museum worker, it's really cool to be here on this side of it. And the staff helping me and all of us set up was just so tremendous, and I just really appreciate you all.
Thanks for coming. Good night.